Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Innovations in International Philanthropy Symposium keynote address. We are delighted to have with us today Kumi Naidoo. Kumi needs no introduction, but for those of you who do not know him, he is an activist, organizer, and leader who has had an extensive impact within climate, organizing, and human rights fields. Kumi began his activism at the age of 15 in South Africa's liberation struggle. He has continued to enact his activism through many different formations and in many different contexts, such as being the founder and or leader of organizations like South African National NGO Coalition, Civicus, Greenpeace, Africans Rising, and Amnesty International, to name just a few. I am honored to be in this conversation with Kumi today, and we will get started by hearing the remarks from him on climate and the role of philanthropy. Kumi, welcome.
Thank you, Solomé, and for that very kind and generous introduction, and greetings, friends and colleagues. Solomé could have introduced me in a slightly different way. She could have said he's been going on doing this work now for more than 4 decades, and he doesn't have that much to show for it. The moment that we find ourselves in history is not a moment for sanitizing the truth. We are challenged to be brutally honest with ourselves. And if I'm completely frank with you, that I am much more nervous these days speaking at a conference like this than I was when I was much younger. And the best way I can tell you why is through a story. I was addressing a group of folks in the United States some years ago, and I was just recounting the deep ecological crisis that we were facing with our oceans collapsing, our forests disappearing, and then to add to it, deepening inequality and so on. And at the end of the speech, a very irate delegate put up her hands and said, Dr. Naidoo, have you heard of Martin Luther King? And thinking it was a trick question, I very gently answered, yes, of course, I've heard of Martin Luther King. And she asked me what was his most famous speech called. And I said, yes, it was I Have a Dream. And she shouted back at me. She said, yes, it was I Have a Dream. But when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare. The oceans are collapsing, the forests are disappearing, and so on. So one of the challenges of leadership in the moment of history that we find ourselves in is being able to speak truth to power, not to sanitize how deep a crisis humanity finds itself in, on the one hand, but to also do it in a way that empowers rather than depresses, demotivates, and immobilizes people, where people believe that it's all over, so what's the point of taking action? But dear colleagues, we are in the most consequential decade in humanity's history. And the truth is, we are 1 minute to midnight in terms of addressing the climate catastrophe, and we are fast running out of time. What we do in the next 10 years will determine what kind of future humanity will have, or whether humanity will have any future at all. I think without any doubt that philanthropy has a critically important role to play in this urgent moment of history in accelerating positive climate action. The UNFCCC said in 2018 that we had 12 years to get emissions to peak and start coming down drastically. And what is extremely evident is that since 2018 till now, 3 years, we have not seen the kinds of urgency that we needed. Of course, we have a new IPCC report, which makes things exceptionally clear that we are fast running out of time. And we are clearly not on track to respond to what the science has been saying we need to do for a long time. But even if we didn't have the science right now, all we need is a little bit of observation skills to look around us across the world and look at how loudly and powerfully Mother Nature is talking to us. From California to Turkey, from Turkey to Algeria, from Algeria to Australia. Wherever we look, we are seeing deep and substantive and terrifying climate impacts. And one of the things that we need to be very clear about how the impact of the first waves of the climate impact underscores why we need to have a sense of climate justice in the way we address the climate problem. The people that are paying the first and most brutal impacts from climate change are those that have contributed least to the problem. And that is why we have a very uncomfortable another framing which needs to be put on the table in this moment of history, and that we have a problem of climate apartheid, in the sense that if we look at which parts of the world historically carries the greatest responsibility for the emissions that are still up there in the atmosphere, and which parts of the world are paying the first and most brutal price, the demographic picture does not look comfortable. And that's why I have no hesitation in naming part of the problem that we have is that of climate apartheid. So philanthropy has a critically important role in making smart strategic investments that will require philanthropy moving out of their comfort zones. So for example, when we look at what happened in 2008 after the global financial crisis that brought immense hardship and pain and suffering to people in rich and poor countries around the world, we saw an important opportunity lost. We could have been then talking about building back better in a more inclusive way, but we didn't. Instead, those with power responded to that moment of history with system protection, system recovery, and system maintenance. Philanthropy cannot ignore what Albert Einstein once said when he said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. Neither can activism, of course, but philanthropy must challenge itself to the point where it must be open to saying, not simply that we need to think out of the box. Maybe you need to throw the box away altogether if in this decade before us, we are able to turn things around so that we are able to avert the worst of catastrophic, irreversible, runaway climate change. So if we are literally a minute before midnight, before things spiral completely out of control for thousands of communities across the world, what should be our response? For countries in the Pacific and small island nations, for example, the catastrophe has already started. For least developed countries, for countries with coastlines, which like Bangladesh, where already we're seeing sea level rise, contaminating the water table, so you cannot do agriculture along coastlines where people grew food in the past. So we have to be very clear that climate impacts are happening on a significant scale now and is already taking significant numbers of lives already. The irony, as I say, though, is that the places that are facing the most brutal impacts of climate change are those that have contributed the least to the problem. So what do we need now? If the response in 2008, 2009 of those in power was about system innovation, system redesign, and system protection, system maintenance, and system recovery, what was urgently needed then and urgently needed even more so now is system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. I want to humbly say to my friends in the philanthropic world that I would argue that today we have very little genuine philanthropy in the world, that in fact we have far too much philanthropy, just for anyone who misses that, FOOL, and you can spell the rest. Let's look specifically then of what's wrong with philanthropy. This manifests itself in two ways when we think about the role of philanthropy in protecting the natural world. So on the one hand, some foundations who on the one hand support environmental activism, on the other hand, they're generating the very resources to fund those organizations by investing in dirty energy investments, for example, in oil, coal, gas, as well as deforestation and so on, because sadly, even today, you can still get better returns on those investments. The good news is that's changing fast. The second issue that we have is that a lot of money goes into the provision of support for service delivery projects and programs, which are not bad in themselves, but often they are treating the symptoms of the problem and are providing a band-aid solution that does not address root causes. We need philanthropic courage right now, not to take the route of going for low-hanging fruits, which actually don't systemically change the problem and the reality we face. We need investments from the philanthropic community that contributes to substantive structural and systemic change. And to be very clear, what we need is a change in our energy system, in our economic system, in our food system, in our transport system, and so on. Small incremental baby steps will not cut it right now because it will be like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while humanity sinks. We need to be holding, in seeking fundamental structural and systemic change, holding corporate and political power to account, and they need to be called out for having delayed action for far too long when the science was clear and the urgency has been clear for quite some time. So the neglected area of investment that I want to focus on has been what I and others call, we have not addressed the ideological state apparatus as much as we've addressed what you could call the repressive state apparatus, the use of army, police, formal laws, and so on. By the ideological state apparatus, we mean the framework for education, religion, social norms and customs, and most crucially, the communications and media frameworks and the environment. We have had denialist leaders in terms of climate, who also have shown high levels of comfort with sexism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, homophobia, and so on, such as Trump, Bolsonaro, Modi, and others. Their rise to power has been aided by their capability of being able to control the communications environment, particularly through social media, through, as we know, micro-targeting on Facebook and so on. And they have shaped not simply an alternative set of views, but almost a counter-reality. I believe it's critically important, if we are going to win, that we need to be able to reach out to the very people that were misinformed and face disinformation, and today either say that vaccines don't help or say that climate change is a Chinese plot or whatever other absurd reasons people have been led to believe. We need to think about how do we win those people back. And let's be very clear. The people that voted for Trump and Brexit and Bolsonaro and so on cannot be seen either by activism or by philanthropy as the enemy. We need to figure out why it is that activism was not able to communicate the truth in a powerful manner so that those lies would never be able to find such fertile ground. And if we look at it, it's because we have underinvested in addressing the misinformation and disinformation challenges that we face. The other challenge that we have is that from an activism point of view and a philanthropic point of view, we have had an over-focus on what people don't have. If you pick up the vision statements of most NGOs and civil society groups, as well as philanthropic organizations, you'll find, reference of how people are marginalized, excluded, repressed, oppressed, and so on. Now, it's not to say that those realities don't shape political life and is very pervasive in terms of what people can or cannot do. But we should consider a shift in our mentality from unwittingly disempowering people even further by how we frame our very activism and philanthropy. Let's pause to consider the current moment at what people do have. You will see a slide on the screen now, which talks about people's pathways to justice, global justice, or climate justice, specifically for this purpose. So what I've done here is put people at the center, right? And try to identify all the different capabilities that people have. And I've put them in 4 quadrants. So one is about harnessing our creative participation, harnessing our autonomy, harnessing our wealth, and harnessing our consumptive power. If we take some of the elements in harnessing our autonomy, people have power as citizens and voters, even when election systems are failing and so on. But people have powers as shapers of their own destiny by creating social movements, trade unions, organizations that fight for their causes and so on. People also have immense power as volunteers. And in this COVID moment, if I look around the world, if we did not have the kind of volunteer energy that was mobilized to support the most desperate people in need, the suffering and pain for hundreds of thousands of people around the world would have been significantly more. And that is the change that we need to be able to foster to prepare for some of the impacts of climate change. That in fact, we are going to need a more humane, a more compassionate, a more caring community spirit, because the only way we're going to get through this challenge of climate change is by us being able to support each other in a more compassionate manner. And in that role, philanthropy is critical. So I want to just talk about the money, harnessing our wealth for a second, because right now we need to be looking at accelerated change strategies. And one of my advice to philanthropic organizations is that it is too late actually right now going after those supporting activism that goes after those companies that are chopping down forests or building dams in indigenous communities' lands in Brazil, or those that are continuing with oil, coal, and gas and so on. We just don't have time to go after that large number of companies that are doing these bad things. We need to follow the money and shut the flow of capital at source. And I would say that if we want to be able to align our interventions with science, the only way I see is to ensure that we put pressure on the world of money and to shut the flow of money to any project that takes us closer to the climate cliff. The other thing that we absolutely need to do, and I'll ask for the second slide to be put on, is we need to get serious about intersectionality. Now, intersectionality is a most powerful concept, given a gift from the feminist movement. Unfortunately, not the easiest and quite a cumbersome word. But unless we are able to understand that climate change does not exist in isolation, climate change is in fact a failure of our economic system, and it's a failure of the subsidiary systems which keep up our economies going, energy, transport, food, and so on. And therefore, unless we understand how different issues intersect with each other, right, we are not going to harness the full potential we have to make the changes we need to have. None of us live single issue lives, right? And therefore, we also have to challenge NGOs as well as the philanthropic community to ensure that they are analyzing the complex situation we find ourselves in an intersectional way and deploying their investments in a much more intersectional way as well. The last thing that foundations must recognize, as Steve Bannon, the campaign manager for Donald Trump, and before that, Karl Rove, the campaign manager of George Bush, is that politics does not drive culture. Culture drives politics. And unless we can start thinking about where people are and how do we not write off people in large numbers, but how do we build bridges for people to get the knowledge they need, to understand that they've been misled, and a bridge that helps people to come from where they are to where we need them to be and to bring them back to a sense of decency. Because at the end of the day, we are all in this together. And unless we are able to convince those that have been misled into believing that climate change is a myth and so on, we will not be able to succeed. And the way we do that, and the kinds of things that foundations should be considering supporting these days, is to ensure we are supporting things that are changing the attitudes, the beliefs, and the approaches that ordinary people have to some of the biggest challenges that we face. And for that reason, philanthropy must look at whether supporting big NGO bureaucracies is the right thing to do moving forward, or whether in fact we should be looking at how do we support individuals who are doing cutting edge things in communities on the ground. How do we support those that are engaged in the in grassroots communities where they are fighting some of the most challenging battles, and sometimes with very little philanthropic dollars because they haven't even been found by philanthropy. So right now, we are talking about the survival of humanity. That is what's on the table. Now, many of you would have heard people like me say at some point, save the climate, save the environment, save the planet. The good news is, friends, is that I would argue today the planet does not need saving. If we continue on the path that we are on, we will continue to destroy our water resources, destroy our soil. The planet gets hotter and hotter. We cannot produce food. The end result, it's not rocket science. We will be gone. The planet will still be here. And for everybody who's very concerned about the planet, let me just say this. Once we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So let's not worry too much about the planet. Let us understand that the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change is nothing more and nothing less than protecting our children and their children's future. And I believe that the philanthropic world has a critically important role to play in shifting the dynamic where we are. The truth is, we are losing at the moment. Mm-hmm. And we must be honest and fess up to that, right? But it is within the capability of human ingenuity, human knowledge, and human creativity that we can turn this around. But it cannot be business as usual. And I would end by saying it cannot be activism as usual, and it cannot also be philanthropic interventions as usual. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Kumi, for those humbling and powerful words, and for the call to urgent, courageous, bold, and imaginative action. If we can now, let's go a bit deeper and tease out some of these powerful messages that you started us off with. At the beginning of your speech, Kumi, you talked about how we need to transition from systems protection and systems redesign or systems protection and systems defense to systems innovation, redesign, and transformation. Can you talk to us a bit more about what that can look like, What are we talking about when we say systems need to be reimagined and transformed?
So let me answer it in this way, right? So right now, if you ask most people in the world, they would say that the biggest disease that humanity is facing is the COVID-19 pandemic. I would argue, horrific as that pandemic is, and many of us have lost loved ones close to us, the worst disease humanity faces right now is affluenza, right? Affluenza is a pathological illness where we have been led to believe that a good, meaningful, decent, prosperous life comes from more and more and more and more acquisitions, material acquisitions. Now, the WWF told us more than almost 2 decades ago that if everybody in the world has to have the same lifestyle that folks in so-called developed countries have and elites in developing countries have, we would need between 5 and 8 planets, right? We have one planet, right? Sometimes we say there's no plan B other than to find a way to address climate because there's no planet B, right? And so what we need is to rebuild our societies almost from bottom up, right? We need to rebuild societies that understand that climate also intersects with many things. Women and gender equity and climate, when we say we need to readdress things, we need to put that at the center. We need to recognize environmental racism is real and continues today, and we need to look at the intersection between those two, for example, right? Climate justice and racial justice. But what we need to also recognize that if we did this with love, with compassion, with boldness and courage, we can create a world where people genuinely are happier and right now, no betting person, anybody who's putting money on this, can with any sense of confidence be betting that humanity is going to get this right? Because the way we have been behaving systemically for a long time, a better option would be to bet that we're never going to get it right. But I want to believe that people who are at this International Philanthropy Symposium, for example, are part of believing that we cannot accept that the world that we live in today is the best that humanity can create for itself. Right? We just refuse to accept that. And given what the stakes are, it really means looking at our education system, looking at our transportation systems. Like, for example, it means making serious investments in public transport, for example, right? Which we are not seeing happening in too many countries around the world. We need to rethink our food system so that food is not traveling as long distance as it currently is to get to tables. We need to be thinking about food security at the local level and so on. So the list of how, because basically what governments are very good at doing, and even philanthropy is very good at doing, is treating the symptoms of the problem without addressing the root causes of the problem. Because foundations need to get good pictures of progress for their annual reports, if I can put it very crudely and bluntly. And governments need to be saying that they are winning so they can secure elections in the next round of elections. We need to be brutally honest with ourselves and with the people that we are trying to address. The current system is broken. It needs major changes, and we don't get that with incremental tinkering.
Indeed. Thank you. It's really about systems and not symptoms. Apologies.
Correct.
I've come down with a cold just in time for this amazing conversation I've been looking forward to with you. Thank you for that point. If we can just go a bit deeper into that conversation, can you talk to us about what's the relationship between policy change and systems change? And if you can also talk about why grassroots groups and social movements play a critical role in bringing about systems change. So the policy level and the movement side of systems change.
Okay, so with the first question, right, if we ask ourselves, how does change happen? Or another way of posing it, how does philanthropy try to make change happen? So if you look at philanthropy specifically, there are three levels at where they are investing. What I call the macro, meso, and micro level. Micro level is where the most of the investments go when you look at it collectively. That's going into projects, programs, service delivery. Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that that investment is illegitimate because somebody has to help the people that are on the cliff of despair. And sometimes those resources help pull people back from the cliff of devastation, right? But I would argue still probably about 70 to 80% of philanthropic dollars is going into service delivery, which largely is treating the symptoms of the problem. Then at the meso level, which I'm calling the policy change level, right, is where I would say now there's probably about 15% of philanthropic dollars are going towards that, which is, trying to support, for example, in the field of gender-based violence, is supporting women's movements that are providing shelters and counseling and safety for women who are. So having governments, for example, pass domestic violence acts is a good thing, right? That's a policy intervention. But what we need is not simply an intervention at the policy level. At the macro level, where governance changes are needed, is where we need to actually be putting major effort moving forward. And sadly, so like think about it, right? If in apartheid South Africa, we wanted to change the apartheid education system, putting our efforts into the policy arena, right, will only get us so far because the whole governance system was racially biased and broken, right? So right now, when we look at our governance systems, in the majority of our countries around the world, if you look at who controls government, who controls decision making and so on, governments should ideally be sort of almost the kind of facilitators of different tensions in society between, the working class and the trade unions and the business community and, people who are doing better off, and to mediate and look at how do you find common ground, or how you find ways in which you're not letting one side dominate and get everything they want. The reality is business, and particularly big business, has completely captured the policy-making arena, and that absolutely needs to change. And then if I go to your second question, right, about, communities and social movements and the centrality, the problem is those that live in the current system, right, are beneficiaries from that system, even though they might have frustrations with that system, right? And therefore, they must we need to find new actors who might be within the system a bit, but have sufficient autonomy and independence that they can ensure that we are being bold, honest, and courageous in what we are saying. Because otherwise, I believe history will judge us extremely harshly, that when the writing was on the wall, that big change was necessary. We cannot let history say, but actually most of the activist community and most of the philanthropic community, they did some good things, but they didn't have the courage to go to the root causes that got us here in the first place. And therefore, social movements have that capability. And by the way, if you look at what's happening with young people, with local communities and so on, they are there already. They have worked out that this system is not working for them and are asking the difficult questions about what big change we need. And let me say it finally, when Greta Thunberg and the young people in Fridays for the Future went before the US Congress and were being sort of given a hard time by certain members of Congress. They were asking them so, okay, what's your solution? What's your solution? Just because we do not have a blueprint of a solution doesn't mean that we don't have a right to say, listen, the current system is broken, right? And why we should expect young children who have challenged us as a generation, talking about my generation, for our failures. Why would we expect them to have a handbook with all the solutions when we don't have it? Doesn't make sense to me. So I would say to leaders in the philanthropic world, you should be supporting people seeking fundamental answers to fundamental questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And speaking of history judging us, you talked about philanthropy, which I love. And you talked about how philanthropy is supporting climate change or climate justice on the one hand, and we may be invested in the industries that are harming our planets on the other hand. Can you talk to us a bit more about what concrete advice would you give to donors who really want to align their mission and values and aspirations with their practices?
Yeah. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge that this is much more easier said than done. I want to acknowledge it. I was the head of Greenpeace and I was the head of Amnesty International. I can tell you how difficult it was to push those two organizations that I led briefly to align, right? Because also, similar to philanthropic organizations, these organizations have to live within the current system, right? They have to comply to a range of laws and controls and so on. And so I just want to acknowledge that it's not easy. It's not a walk in the park. But with political will, which is needed now in huge amounts of quantity, in huge truckloads or shiploads of courage is needed, is for us to be is that in line, right, with what we're saying to people in the world that they should do, right? The thing that stands out, and I have to pay tribute to many foundations, particularly in the United States, less so in other parts of the world, but it's moving. And also even in the United States, lots of foundations haven't cleaned up the act yet. But there was an initiative called Divest, Invest, Philanthropy, which has been asking foundations to divest their investments from fossil fuels and other polluting and climate destroying activities, and to instead put their investments under this. Now I'm talking about not their philanthropic investments, but the investments would generate their sort of wealth, right? And it doesn't make sense, obviously. So at this conference, I would make an appeal to every foundation who still has some of their investments in any economic activity that is taking us closer to the climate cliff, clean that up immediately. But there's more than that, right? It's more than just doing it. That might sound tough, but that's about the easiest thing that you can do, right? But it's a question of asking yourself, how do you deal with the elephant in the room? And the elephant in the room is saying that if we are to have the lifestyle for everybody in the world that people say in the United States have, or the people doing reasonably well in the United States have, then we're going to need between 5 and 8 planets. How do we deal with that? And how do we deal with the fact that Earth overshoot today, which is, in a year, if we are responsible and sustainable, the Earth can replenish itself in a year, right? But right now, by April, May, we hit the Earth overshoot day, which means already we've used the entire budget, for the year. So we're not replenishing, right? How do we get to the point where we do that? And that is why I think that we have to deal with this disease called affluenza, right? Because unless we can recover the appreciation for nature, for community, for family, for sport, not simply sitting on a couch and watching it, but actually engaging in it like we all used to do when I was growing up. Unless we start recapturing some of the things that we lost as a species, right, that gave us value and meaning in our lives, and address the real problem of affluenza, I don't think foundations will be able to align their work with their values, or their investments with the values, because the values are great. What foundations say they want to do and so on, you can really disagree with them. And also, to be fair, I'm not saying anybody's acting in bad faith. I think people act in pretty good faith. But we are in a bind where our political and business leadership has let us down so badly that we cannot rely on them to be solutions oriented. It has to come from below. It has to come, I hope, also from foundations in taking up a leadership role here where there's been such a vacuum of innovation and courage in leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. I keep going back to your message and your invitation for us to move with courage in this moment, with courage and compassion. You talked a little bit about the ideological state apparatus, and I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit more about what do you think the relationship should be between philanthropy and the state? And would you be able to talk about the relationship between social movements and the state?
So let's just remind ourselves that the state is different from government, right? Or let's put it this way, the state should be different from government. Government comes and government goes. The state should be there building institutions that endure the transition of different governments and so on. So I think that philanthropy, because philanthropy gets a social license, a license to operate from the state, right? Puts the relationship in a very clear power dynamic. The state has significantly more power in formal legalistic sense than philanthropy does. However, in many countries around the world, right, like it or not, Bill Gates has more power than even a minister or the president of that country, because he can walk in with money that he has available to deploy, right? And that creates another whole problem, right? I remember when I was leading the global call to action against poverty, which some of you might remember as the white band movement or the Make Poverty History movement, where there were lots of celebrities that we had mobilized to help. And the reason we did that was very much because of the ideological state apparatus that we face. That in fact, the only way we could reach large numbers of ordinary people was to use people who had real power, right? And, real visibility, let's say, visible public presence. And then people were saying, well, Kumi, be careful, you're creating a new problem. I said, what problem is that? They said, you're creating a problem of celebrocracy, right? Which is the domination of public space by celebrities. So I'm not calling for a domination of public space by philanthropy, but I do think that philanthropy has and there are many good relationships that philanthropy has with governments in many parts of the world that have endured. If I take a case in the Gambia, a small West African nation, they've had various changes in government over time, but the NGO community, including those from the outside that are operating there, were able to survive and prosper and serve, even when there were, significant changes. That's how it should be. And I do think that sometimes philanthropic organizations are faced with really difficult choices. I remember when the Modi government in India started clamping down on NGOs and foundations, many of the very well-known foundations had to leave India, for example, or reduce the operation significantly. So the relationship between philanthropy and the state will always be a bit rocky, and that's how it should be. I would think in the current moment, philanthropy should encourage and support the state to make the changes that they need to make to avert climate catastrophe. I think that the good news we have today, virtually every government in the world today, now that Trump is no longer in office, does not quibble about the science, says we need to act on it. The difference is, even the CEOs of Shell and all the big fossil fuel companies who have had the, let's say, the opportunity to engage with in my life, they all now say, yes, climate change is very bad, the science is very clear, we need to change. But when you look at the fine print of what they're saying, they want to extend the life of the fossil fuel industry way beyond the 50s, to 2050 and beyond. Let's be very clear. Given what we know now, 1 cent more investment in fossil fuels is an investment in the death of our children and their children. And we cannot put our head in the sand anymore and continue to pretend that we don't have as big a crisis as we have. So I hope that the philanthropic community will have a strong backbone to stand up to governments where necessary, present, support sort of fact-based advocacy, evidence-based advocacy, and that's the same thing for social movements and civil society more generally. I don't think it's different. I think, it's similar for philanthropy as it is for the broader civil society community. Where we can collaborate with our governments, right? I don't like the word partnership because partnership is an overstated word in this context. I think where we can have relationships of mutual respect and where we can support governments to do the right thing when they are doing the right things and so on, I would, of course, encourage that, right? There are many governments, right, around the world who are attempting to do some significant changes in the way they operate and so on. And I think philanthropic support, especially to small, weak governments to make those changes, is what I think should be considered.
Thank you. You talked about how it's culture that shapes politics, not the other way around. And you invited philanthropy to think about how are we investing in cultural change? How are we investing in narrative shifts and arts? Can you just give us some advice on what kind of work should we be thinking about supporting specifically within the frame of narrative shift or cultural change?
So firstly, for change to be enduring and successful and impactful, change can only be all of those things when large numbers of ordinary people understand what we are fighting for and feel motivated to contribute to it, right? However smart some of us might think we are, right? Come up with a great idea, a great proposal, we'll do this. But if we don't carry people with us, right, those investments could end up being failures because you have not built the popular support to actually protect those investments and savings. So it's critically important that we understand that 80%, okay, I'm going to probably get criticized for saying this, but I would say 80% of activism is about changing attitudes, changing people's understanding, and helping develop people's confidence to oppose and resist where they need to, and build and create and co-create with their governments and other social forces for the way to go forward, right? But all of that second part of it only starts when ideas are presented in accessible ways. Let me give you a quick example, if I might, right? I was on an inflatable boat in 2011 going to occupy an oil rig in the Greenlandic Arctic. while I was bubbling along on this um, inflatable boat, my colleagues could see that I was very nervous because I pretty much a horrible swimmer, and they say to me, "Ah, no, don't worry, Kumi, yeah? Everything's going to be fine. Even if you fall in this rough sea, you'll survive for at least 2 hours, and we can fish you out, right?" And I look at these waves, and I thought, "Shoo! If I fall, it might actually take more than 2 hours to fish me out." And I was thinking, if this is the last protest I engage in my life, 99% of my people, friends, colleagues, family, and so on back home in Africa won't have a clue what exactly the banner said. It said, "Stop Arctic Destruction," right? 2011 this was. And some young people in my family, when I came out of prison in Greenland, they said, "By the way, Uncle Kumi, that was a really stupid poster. Stop Arctic Destruction. What does that mean?" A better slogan would have been, "Save Santa Claus now." Save Santa Claus now. Think about it. It's brilliant because that's the only association that ordinary people have with that part of the world. And let's be clear, much as we love our scientists and we applaud them for all the hard work they've done in terms of bringing the climate science forward, they are the worst communicators in the world, right? Between the parts per million and the degrees and all of this, people are lost. So we have to start supporting a massive communication effort that does not approach this, in a simplistic way, but we must approach this in a communications accessible way, because it is not rocket science in the end. If we connect climate change to water, to soil, to food, to transport, and all the real things that people use in their lives. So that's what I'm hoping we will have the courage to do. And I honestly believe that one of the best investments that philanthropy could do, right, including in countries like the United States, is to pool the resources together, do analysis of the information system that's playing itself out, and then figure out a way of how you reach the people that need to be reached with the kinds of sort of absolutely scientifically verified information, no lying, no exaggerations, but telling people the truth. And if people are empowered with the truth, they will be able, and that's been my experience in South Africa as a young activist, people will rise up in the most oppressive and repressive environments if they understand what is at stake. And I hope that philanthropic investments will help the climate movements achieve that.
Yeah, that's great. And, I love that idea about philanthropy collaborating to pull resources together. And I think I would only add, as we do the analysis, move the money, because there's ways in which philanthropy can focus so much on doing the analysis, the money lags far behind the research and the studies and all the evidence we need to bring together. And lastly, we'll close out with a very similar theme around, can you just give us, if you had to say the top 3 things you want funders to do and to fund when it comes to climate justice, what would they be? What do you want funders to think about as we walk away from this brilliant call to action from you? What are the top 3 things we should be walking away with?
1, fully embrace intersectionality, right? Unless you embrace intersectionality and understand how climate funding intersects with health, with education, with gender equity, and so on, you will be missing a range of opportunities that you absolutely cannot be afford to be missing, right? Mm-hmm. That's one. Second, and sorry, let me just say specifically there, it means addressing historical injustices as well, right? And how it plays itself in the present, such as the intersection between environmental injustice and racial injustice. The second is understand that this struggle that we have to fight is going to require an all hands on deck approach, right? It means working class people, rural poor, unemployed, and so on have to be part of the solution. If we leave them as spectators, then we will pay a price for that that will be devastating, and in the end will probably put at risk our capability to address what the science says we need to. So, yeah, that's the second. The third, I would say, is so the second, sorry, is about then looking at where those people are. Because you see, activism is not about, and this I find strange, and I see this more in the wealthier parts of the world, where activism is almost defined as what you do is you say what your policy is, what your position is, and you go and you recruit everybody who agrees with you already, and then you create an echo chamber, right? And that echo chamber reinforces how committed and so on. And you're always saying we need to broaden our base, we need to, build our constituency, but the language that you use, the very language that you use, people look at you and say, what are you talking about? Right? So the second thing is about really investing in the most marginalized and especially in the frontline communities. The third thing that I say is related to the second is understand that if people have knowledge and information and skills, they will be able to do extraordinary things. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they are enabled and supported to do that, right? They don't need the capacity built, as some funders say, right? You know, like when you know, some well-meaning people say, I want to come to Africa and empower women in Africa, I say, how are you going to empower a woman who's able to survive with almost nothing, right? She needs to empower you in terms of how you can actually survive with as little as she's able to survive, right? So I'm not talking about a paternalistic conversation here. I'm talking about a respectful conversation of equals. Mm-hmm. So the last thing I would say is there's a word now called artivism, right? Which is how to bring the words of arts and culture and the word of activism together in a communications to enhance our communications impact. I would say explore the space of artivism and see how you can invest in it. And if I might be allowed a fifth one, and that is follow the money. Follow the money. That's the biggest thing. Follow the money. And if you support folks who are trying to shut the flow of capital at source to things that are going to do damage to our climate reality, that's the most powerful investment you can make in the short term. And the good news is, most of these institutions, the financial institutions, ever since 2008 and 2009, have not recovered their public standing, right? They have a very low level of public support. And they know it. I've met with many of those CEOs of those institutions. They know it. They're anxious about it. And now, given what the IPCC has just said, that we are fast running out of time, don't underestimate the capability of a well-organized effort to appeal to the humanity of these institutions and their leadership to stop funding things that hurt us and start investing in things that help contribute to the solutions to the climate crisis.
Absolutely. That point about frontline communities not needing capacity building is so important. I wish I could just kind of magnify and amplify it across philanthropy, but we do as donors need our capacities built to be in right relationship with frontline communities. And thank you for doing that work for us today. I felt like what you just did today was to strengthen and build our own capacities, to remind us that yes, we're a minute before midnight. And there are things we can do. We can fund the frontline communities. We can fund intersectionally. we can fund artivism and culture change, and we can follow the money. And that in itself is what can be transformational for us all. Thank you for joining us today, Kumi. Really appreciated your words of wisdom and learned a lot. And I hope you have a wonderful evening where you are.
Thank you very much, Solome.